The sun was blazing down on the small town of Fort Lauderdale, Florida, but the heat didn't stop the excitement. Cars lined the beach, packed with young men and women, all waiting for something big to happen. The air was thick with anticipation, and the sound of laughter and music filled the air. But nobody expected what was about to walk through the door of the beachside club. Elvis Presley, the king of rock and roll, stepped off a bus and onto the sandy road. He was surrounded by his bandmates Andy, Wilbur, and Doc. They were a sight to see, with Elvis leading the way in his signature style: black leather jacket, tight jeans, and a smile that could light up a room. But there was something different about him today. He seemed more relaxed, almost playful, as if he was about to embark on a wild adventure. The club was owned by Big Frank, a man who looked more like a comic book villain than a real person. He was short, with a round belly and a thick mustache that curled up at the ends. He wore a suit that was a little too tight, and his voice was loud and boisterous. But despite his intimidating appearance, Big Frank was more of a joke than a threat. His daughter Valerie was about to head off to Florida, and he was worried sick about her. He had a rant ready, full of jokes about the dangers of the beach and the boys who would try to take advantage of her. It was all so over the top that it made you want to laugh. Elvis and his bandmates knew they had a mission. They were supposed to keep an eye on Valerie, but they were also planning something a bit more fun. Elvis had a way of talking that made people do what he wanted, and he convinced Big Frank to send them to Florida to protect his daughter. Big Frank, already flustered and a bit befuddled, agreed without a second thought. Once they arrived in Florida, the real fun began. The beach was a paradise, and the girls were everywhere. Elvis, being the leader, had his sights set on Valerie, but his bandmates had other ideas. Andy, Wilbur, and Doc were more interested in the other girls on the beach, and they spent most of their time trying to impress them, often with hilarious results. Elvis, on the other hand, found himself drawn to Valerie, who was smart, funny, and a lot more interesting than he had expected. Valerie, however, had her own plans. She didn't want to be watched over like a little girl. She wanted to be free, to explore, and to have her own adventures. Her father's overprotective attitude only made her more determined to break free. She was tired of being treated like she was fragile and needed to be protected. She wanted to prove that she could handle herself, just like any of the boys. As the days went by, Elvis and Valerie began to form a connection. They laughed together, explored the beach, and even faced a few challenges. But the real test came when Valerie's father decided to test her and Elvis's loyalty. He sent a group of guys to pretend to be interested in Valerie, just to see if she would fall for their charms. But Valerie was smarter than they thought, and she saw right through their act. Elvis, meanwhile, was torn. He had a job to do, but he was starting to care about Valerie in a way he hadn't expected. He realized that she wasn't just a mission or a job. She was a person with her own dreams and desires. And as they spent more time together, he found himself wanting to help her achieve those dreams, not just protect her. The beach was a place of fun, but it was also a place of change. For Elvis, it was a chance to break out of his usual roles and be something more. For Valerie, it was a chance to prove that she was more than just a girl who needed protecting. And for the bandmates, it was a chance to have the time of their lives. But the real question was, what would happen when it was time to go back home? Would Elvis and Valerie's newfound connection survive the return to reality? Or would it be just another summer fling? And what about Big Frank? Would he finally realize that his daughter was capable of handling her own life? The sun was setting on the beach, casting a golden glow over the sand. The music was still playing, and the laughter hadn't stopped. But for Elvis and Valerie, the real adventure was just beginning. Elvis was always a bit of a shy guy, even when he was a big star. When Elwood and I first met him for the movie, he was super polite and impressed by our work with the Three Stooges and the Bowery Boys. He really wanted to do comedy, and he was eager to make it work. One of the funniest scenes in the movie is when Elvis first arrives at the spa. He's distracted by all the pretty girls and ends up tripping over a table. I was there when they filmed it, and he did it in a way that was funny but not over the top. He was really worried about whether it was funny, so he came over to me and the director, Norman Torog, to ask if it worked. He was really dedicated to doing a good job. The movie follows a familiar Elvis formula. He has a job, a funny sidekick, a rival, a pretty girl he likes, and a boss. But there were some new twists. His boss was a woman, Vera Radford, who ran a girls' health ranch. Julie Adams played a tough but kind woman who supported Elvis when other people complained about his singing. Jack Mulaney was his sidekick, Stanley Potter, who was more creative than the usual sidekicks. Edward Faulkner played the rival, Brad Bentley, but he was more of a comic character than a serious rival. Jocelyn Lane was the pretty girl, Pam Merritt, who had a dramatic subplot about a gold mine her grandfather left her. Some bad guys were trying to take it from her, and Elvis, of course, came to her rescue. One of the funniest parts of the movie is when Elvis and his sidekick have to deal with a group of crooks pretending to be ghosts to scare Pam. It's a lot like the Three Stooges or the Bowery Boys movies, and Elvis really gets into it. He makes these big, funny faces, just like the comedians he admired. The monster masks were made by Ellis Berman S.R., who was famous for creating some of the best monster masks around. The whole movie has a really fun vibe, and Elvis seemed to be having a great time. One of the actresses, Francine York, said that Elvis was always joking around on set and made everyone feel good. In a scene where Elvis teaches her how to shoot a bow and arrow, he gets really close to her, and Pam, the pretty girl, gets jealous. Another actress, Mary Anders, plays a hungry lady who tries to get more food from Elvis's sidekick. It's all very silly and fun, with a lot of slapstick comedy mixed in. Elvis's songs in the movie are actually from his older albums, which means there are no new songs. But the songs they chose are some of his best, like Dirty Dirty Feeling and It Feels So Right. The music is really good, even if the songs weren't written for the movie. Some of the songs, like Such an Easy Question and I'm Yours, were big hits and did well on the charts. Even though some critics, like Howard Thompson from the New York Times, didn't like the movie, a lot of people did. Theater owners said it was one of Elvis's best films, and that it made a lot of money. The studio even sent Elvis's white Cadillac on a tour to promote the movie, and they gave out tickle feathers as prizes. The movie ended up being one of the biggest hits of the year, and even won Elvis a Golden Laurel Award for Best Male Performance in a Musical Film. It was the only acting award he ever won. The next movie, Harum Scarum, wasn't as good. It was a bit of a letdown, and the songs weren't as interesting. But even with its flaws, Elvis's fans still loved him, and the soundtrack album did well. The movie was about Elvis going on an adventure in a magical land, but it didn't have the same charm as Tickle Me. Despite that, Elvis's dedication and talent always shone through, and he remained a big star. Elvis was really excited about his new movie, Harum Scarum. He loved the idea of playing a character in costume, especially one that reminded him of his idol, Rudolph Valentino. Valentino was a silent movie star who was famous for his intense, expressive eyes. Elvis thought this movie would be a chance to show off his acting skills. He even liked his shake costume so much that he wore it home to show his girlfriend, Priscilla. At first, Elvis was really into the project. He thought the character would be a great challenge. But as filming went on, he realized the movie wasn't what he hoped it would be. The plot was silly, his character was kind of a joke, and the songs were just not good. Elvis got so frustrated that he started to lose interest. He even stopped trying to get the songs right, telling the musicians to record their parts without him, and he added his vocals later. The story of Harum Scarum is about a singer who makes action movies. In one of his films, he plays a character in a desert adventure. When he goes to the Middle East to promote the movie, some bad guys mistake him for the action hero and want him to do a dangerous job. This could have been a funny movie, but it didn't work out that way. The jokes weren't funny, and the movie ended up being just another disappointing Elvis film. Elvis's co-star, Mary Ann Mobley, said that Elvis would joke about how the movie wouldn't change history. She believed Elvis was a better actor than the movies allowed him to be. When Elvis saw the finished film, he knew it was a dud. Even his manager, Colonel Parker, thought it was bad. Parker suggested adding a talking camel to make it seem like the silliness was on purpose, but the studio didn't go for it. The critics didn't like Harum Scarum either. Some said Elvis's charm was the only thing that made the movie watchable, but others thought it was terrible. Moviegoers also weren't impressed. Many theaters reported that it was Elvis's worst movie yet. Despite this, the movie still made some money, and the soundtrack album did well. But Elvis knew he had made a turkey. He gave the director, Gene Nelson, an autographed picture with a note saying, "Someday we'll do it right." After Harum Scarum, Elvis made another movie called Frankie and Johnny. This one was different because it was set in the 1920s, a time known as the Roaring Twenties. The movie was based on a famous song about a woman named Frankie, who shot her cheating lover, Johnny. Elvis played Johnny, a gambler who keeps getting into trouble with the women in his life. The movie had a great cast, including Harry Morgan and Donna Douglas, who was famous for being on a TV show called The Beverly Hillbillies. The director, Fred de Cordova, did a good job of making the 1920s setting look authentic and colorful. But even with all these good things, the movie wasn't very good. The jokes were weak, and the songs, while having a 1920s feel, weren't that great. One song, Hard Luck, was really good, but it wasn't released as a single. The critics had mixed feelings about Frankie and Johnny. Some thought it was another successful Elvis movie, while others thought it was just more of the same. The movie made money, but it didn't have the impact that Elvis's earlier films had. If Anne Margaret, who was a big star at the time, had played Frankie, the movie might have been better. But it didn't happen, and Frankie and Johnny ended up being Donna Douglas's last movie. Elvis's movies in the 1960s were a mix of good and bad. They made a lot of money, but they weren't the kind of movies that would make Elvis proud. Even though he was paid well, he must have felt frustrated that he couldn't show off his full talents. Despite the money and fame, Elvis knew he was capable of more. Douglas had a tough time during the making of the movie. She fell for Elvis Presley, but there was no actual romance between them. Elvis was getting spiritual guidance from his hairstylist, Larry Geller, and Douglas found these conversations interesting. They talked a lot, and a close bond formed. But once the movie wrapped up, Elvis moved on to his next project, leaving Douglas heartbroken. She had such a hard time that she struggled to return to her TV show, and the producers had to help her through it. The movie's title song didn't do well on the charts, staying at number 25 for just 8 weeks. The soundtrack album also didn't perform very well, reaching only number 20. Despite this, the soundtrack was re-released in 1976 by a budget label called Pickwick, but with 3 songs missing. This re-release caused issues later when RCA tried to release the full album after Elvis's death in 1977. It wasn't until 2010 that the complete soundtrack was finally available again. This wasn't the first time Frankie and Johnny had been made into a movie. There were 2 earlier versions in 1930 and 1936. A more recent version in 1991, starring Michelle Pfeiffer and Al Pacino, was based on a play. By 1966, many young people had moved on from Elvis and were now fans of the Beatles. Elvis's fans were waiting for him to come back with something exciting. But releasing a dull 1920s musical when the Beatles were putting out great albums like Rubber Soul and Revolver wasn't going to win back those fans. The film didn't do well at the box office, finishing at number 47 for 1966. Some theaters did well, but one theater owner even said, "Elvis is out." The movie barely made $2 million. In some cities, it was shown with a Beatles movie to boost ticket sales. For Elvis's next movie, producer Hal Wallis decided to take him back to Hawaii, where he had his biggest hit with Blue Hawaii. But Paradise Hawaiian Style showed how much Elvis's career had slipped. Paradise Hawaiian Style was directed by Michael D. Moore, with a screenplay by Alan Weiss and Anthony Lawrence. It was produced by Hal Wallis, and the cinematography was by W. Wallace Kelly. The movie was filmed in Hawaii and released in July 1966. It features Elvis as a pilot trying to make it in the tourist business, but the plot is thin, and the songs aren't very memorable. Elvis seems less enthusiastic this time, and he looks a bit heavier. The director tried to hide this, but it's still noticeable. One of the standout scenes involves Elvis and a woman transporting show dogs by plane. The dogs cause chaos, and Elvis sings a song in the middle of it. It's meant to be funny, but it doesn't really work. Donna Butterworth, a child actress, has a significant role in the movie, singing several duets with Elvis. She was from Hawaii and had already appeared in other movies. She remembers meeting Elvis as a dream come true. Despite the lack of a strong plot, the movie was still popular with Elvis fans, who were always eager to see him on screen. Elvis's next project after filming in Hawaii was a meeting with the Beatles. They had been trying to meet him for years, and finally, on August 27, 1965, they got their chance. The meeting was private, and no photos were taken. The Beatles were in awe, and Elvis broke the ice by joking that he would go to bed if they just stared at him. They started playing music together, and the evening was friendly and enjoyable. Paul McCartney, in particular, bonded with Elvis over their shared interest in the bass guitar. Despite the Beatles' huge success, Elvis was still their idol, and the meeting was a memorable moment for all of them. Elvis Presley was at the peak of his fame, but the world of music and movies was changing. The Beatles, a band that Elvis had once inspired, were now the biggest thing around. One night, Elvis and the Beatles met at his house. It was a historic meeting. The Beatles were excited to jam with Elvis. Ringo even played drums on a chair during the session. John Lennon, always curious, asked Elvis why he didn't tour and make more rock and roll music. Elvis explained that he had movie contracts that he needed to fulfill. Despite the Beatles' success, Elvis didn't seem too impressed with his own movie career. Paul McCartney later said that meeting Elvis was one of the greatest moments of his life. The next day, some of Elvis's friends went to visit the Beatles. John told Marty Lacker, one of Elvis's close friends, that the night before was the best night of his life. It was a magical moment for everyone involved. But the Beatles weren't the only British stars Elvis met during this time. While filming Paradise Hawaiian Style, Elvis also had a humorous encounter with Herman's Hermits. Peter No One, the lead singer, tried to get Elvis to name his favorite group. No one didn't expect Elvis to say, "The Los Angeles Police Department," which made everyone laugh but left no one speechless. Elvis also met Tom Jones, a Welsh singer he admired. When they met, Tom was surprised to find out that Elvis was a fan of his music. They sang together, and it was a moment of mutual respect. Despite these enjoyable moments, Elvis was aware that his movies were becoming formulaic and less exciting. Paradise Hawaiian Style was another film that followed the same pattern, and it made Elvis wonder if he was still the same artist he once was. In 1966, Elvis starred in Spinout, a movie that tried to recapture some of the magic of his earlier films. Directed by Norman Taurog, Spinout was a lightweight musical comedy. Elvis played Mike McCoy, a race car driver and the lead singer of a rock and roll band. The movie also starred Shelley Fabares, who Elvis had worked with before and was comfortable around. In Spinout, Mike is pursued by three women: Cynthia, the daughter of a wealthy businessman; Les, the female drummer in his band; and a nosy author writing a book about the perfect American male. Each woman tries to win Mike's heart, but he's determined to stay a free and happy bachelor. The movie includes some fun scenes, like when Mike convinces an older couple to go on a second honeymoon so he can watch their house. It's a light and amusing moment. Spinout also had some good songs, even if they weren't as memorable as Elvis's earlier hits. One standout was "I'll Be Back," which Elvis performed with his usual charm. The movie was a hit, and fans enjoyed seeing Elvis back on the big screen in a more upbeat role. However, Elvis was still frustrated with the direction of his career. He wanted to do more challenging roles and work with better directors. He even recorded a Bob Dylan song, "Tomorrow is Such a Long Time," which showed his ability to adapt to new styles of music. But the song was buried on the Spinout soundtrack, a decision that missed an opportunity to show Elvis's versatility. Critics had mixed reactions to Spinout. Some praised it for its entertainment value, while others found it formulaic and less impressive than Elvis's earlier films. But what mattered most was the reaction of the fans. Many of them were happy to see Elvis back in a movie that felt more like the Elvis they knew and loved. Elvis's stardom continued to shine, even if he wasn't always happy with the roles he was given. His presence in Hollywood was still powerful, and he remained a beloved icon. But the changing times and the rise of new artists like the Beatles were a reminder that Elvis needed to evolve if he wanted to stay relevant. By the time Elvis made Easy Come, Easy Go, his movie career wasn't as shiny as it used to be. People still went to see his movies, but they weren't as excited as before. Elvis was known for his catchy songs and fun movies, but by 1967, he seemed to be just going through the motions. Easy Come, Easy Go was originally supposed to be a movie for a surf rock duo named Jan and Dean. But when Jan got into a bad car accident, the movie was changed to be an Elvis movie instead. Elvis played a Navy frogman looking for buried treasure, but the movie was kind of slow and not very exciting. The songs were mellow, except for the title track and a fast-paced song called You Gotta Stop. There was also a really silly song called Yoga Is As Yoga Does, where Elvis sang with an older actress named Elsa Lanchester. It was meant to be funny, but it just didn't work well. The director, John Rich, wasn't very excited about making another Elvis movie. He even said that the producer, Hal Wallis, didn't care much about the movie. The movie didn't do very well at the box office, and the soundtrack didn't sell many copies. Elvis was starting to feel really frustrated with Hollywood. He felt like he was just a joke to the people making these movies. But not everyone thought the movie was bad. A magazine called Variety said it was a well-made movie, and that it would do well in drive-in theaters. But that's because they were used to seeing Elvis movies, and didn't expect anything too exciting. While Easy Come, Easy Go was being made, Elvis was also filming another movie called Double Trouble. This one was a bit better. It tried to make Elvis look more like the Beatles, who were really popular at the time. Elvis played a singer in London and Antwerp, and he got involved in a mystery with spies and jewel thieves. The movie had some fun songs, and Elvis seemed to enjoy working with the Weir brothers, who were a comedy act. But even Double Trouble felt out of touch with what was happening in the real world. The Beatles were making groundbreaking albums like Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, and the world was changing fast. Elvis was stuck in a rut, making the same kind of movies over and over. He wanted to do something different, but his manager, Colonel Tom Parker, kept signing him up for these formulaic films. It was a tough time for Elvis, but little did anyone know that things were about to change. Elvis wasn't just unimpressed with the songs he had to sing in Double Trouble, he was flat out frustrated. He kept showing up late to the recording sessions, and the studio decided to move the sessions to the soundstage, which had terrible acoustics. This only made things worse. Elvis tried his best to make something out of the song Old MacDonald, but after hours of effort, they had to use the seventh, incomplete take as the master. The only bright spot was Long-Legged Girl with the Short Dress On, which turned out to be the best song in the movie. During the filming, Elvis met singer Jackie Wilson, someone he had admired for years. He even went to see Wilson perform, and later invited him to the set. Another encounter was with James Brown, who had tried to meet Elvis many times, but always called Graceland when Elvis was asleep. When Elvis learned James Brown was at the Wilson show, he went to Brown's table, something he rarely did. They had a great laugh when Brown said, "Man, you sure do sleep a lot." Elvis and James stayed friends until the end. Despite winning a Grammy for his gospel album, How Great Thou Art, and getting married to Priscilla in 1967, Elvis wasn't having much success. Double Trouble didn't do well at the box office, and it was even worse than Easy Come, Easy Go. The New York Times seemed to have given up on Elvis movies, and theater owners weren't impressed either. One owner in South Carolina said, "We are always happy to have Elvis in anything, but I sure hope he will be given better roles. I'm still waiting for more like Blue Hawaii or Viva Las Vegas." The year 1967 was one of the lowest points in Elvis's career. His next movie, Clambake, didn't help. In this film, he plays Scott Hayward, a rich kid who swaps identities with a water skiing instructor to see what life is like as a regular person. But the movie felt like a step backward. Elvis was dressed in a rhinestone cowboy outfit, the kind he used to hate. He called Priscilla from the set and complained about how bad the movie was. Co-star Shelley Fabares remembered Elvis muttering, "What are we doing here?" while setting up for a scene. The plot of Clambake was thin. Scott, the rich kid, drives to Florida in a Corvette and meets Tom Wilson, who is on his way to a job as a water skiing instructor. They switch identities, and Scott has to pretend to be a water skiing instructor, while Tom pretends to be rich. Diane Carter, played by Shelley Fabares, wants Scott to teach her water skiing, but she's only interested in him because she thinks he's rich. Bill Bixby, who later became famous for the courtship of Eddie's father, plays the smarmy rich guy who expects to get whatever he wants. His character provides some of the best comic moments in the movie. Scott ends up fixing a boat for a race using a material his father's company had developed. He wins the race, reveals his true identity to Diane, and she faints. Despite the plot, Elvis was unhappy with the script from the start. He gained 30 pounds before filming and fell at home, getting a mild concussion. Filming was delayed for nearly 3 weeks while he recovered. Elvis still tried to have fun on set. Will Hutchins, who played Tom, recalled that Elvis was the most talented person he ever worked with. Hutchins said, "Sometimes I'd feel a tad lost. 1 take Elvis and 20 take Hutchins. He'd give me a grin, a pat on the back, a comforting word he'd make me feel like his salary." Hutchins also remembered a time when Elvis invited him into his trailer and played a record of Charles Boyer reciting love poems. It was a side of Elvis that few people saw. Elvis always cited Clambake as his worst movie, and it's easy to see why. Even though Variety gave it a good review, the New York Times called it a silly, tired little frolic. The only good song in the movie was You Don't Know Me, which Elvis sang beautifully. The soundtrack album included 2 bonus tracks, Big Boss Man and Guitar Man, which were some of the best rockers he had done in years. By this point, Elvis was fed up with the movies. His contract with MGM was almost over, and he was serious about not signing another one. He told Colonel Tom Parker that he'd quit the business before he'd do another movie like Clambake. It was a turning point for Elvis, and he was ready for something new. By the time 1968 rolled around, Elvis was ready for a change. He had a few more movies left on his contract, but he was eager to get back to live performances, something he hadn't done since 1961. He was also negotiating for a Christmas special that year. Despite his early promise as an actor, Elvis was no longer getting the good scripts or challenging roles he craved. His movies had become formulaic and unexciting, and he knew he needed to do something important to stay relevant in the entertainment world. One of those final movies was Stay Away, Joe. It was released in March 1968 and filmed in Arizona. In this movie, Elvis played Joe Lightcloud, a Navajo man who wants to prove that his people can successfully raise cattle on their reservation. The film starts with some promising visuals, thanks to director Peter Tewksbury, who captures the beautiful Arizona landscapes. But the plot quickly disintegrates into a series of brawls, dances, and physical gags that don't add up to much. The movie is disjointed and lacks a clear narrative, making it one of Elvis's weakest films. It didn't help that the depiction of Native Americans was stereotypical and often offensive, which drew criticism from reviewers. Despite the movie's flaws, some theater owners reported good attendance, and the film did have a decent cast, including Burgess Meredith, Joan Blundell, and Katie Jurado. The direction and cinematography were good, but they couldn't save the film from its poor script and lack of substance. Next up was Speedway, released in June 1968. This movie followed the same formula that had worked for Elvis in the past: a macho job, pretty girls, and a lot of music. Elvis played a race car driver, and the film featured Nancy Sinatra as the lead actress. The music, however, was lackluster, and the plot was simple and shallow. Behind the scenes, Elvis's personal life was changing. Priscilla, his wife, was pregnant with their first child, and she visited the set during filming. This news seemed to lift Elvis's spirits, and he appeared more upbeat during the production. Speedway performed better at the box office than many of Elvis's recent films, but it was still a far cry from the kind of movies he wanted to make. By the end of 1968, Elvis was determined to move on from Hollywood. He had a few more movies to complete, but he was already planning his return to live performances. He wanted to reinvent himself and reconnect with his fans in a more meaningful way. The world was changing rapidly, and Elvis knew he had to change with it. His final films might not have been his best, but they were a stepping stone to a new chapter in his career.